A few years ago, I was preparing to submit a big investigative news story to Foreign Policy magazine. That action would set into motion a series of irrevocable events that would not only send my work out into the world, but would likely upset people in the halls of power. I remember my heart was trembling. I'd spent months on the investigation, interviewed scores of people, and traveled to far reaches such as Ghana. But even as I prepared to hit send, my inner voice yelled at me, "Who do you think you are?" We tend to think of our inner voice as being truer and more reliable than the voice of others when making decisions. In stories passed down and in inspirational sayings from movies and books and even on pillows, we're told that our inner voice, our true self, our heart, is the one that can guide us best. Even Steve Jobs, in his famous Stanford commencement address, counseled us, don't let the noise of others drown out your own inner voice. But what if your inner voice is a liar? We rely on our inner voice to make quick decisions. And to give you a small taste of how very many decisions that is, Cornell University tells us we make 267 decisions a day on food alone. So in one sense, our inner voice is nothing more than a series of pre-recorded messages that help us make quick decisions based on past experience, giving us a sense of the present by using our past. And most of the time that works out okay, and if it doesn't, it's not such a big deal. But sometimes our inner voice can trick us and lead us seriously astray, because sometimes what our inner voice says just isn't true. Memories are faulty, and our inner shortcuts can become cognitive biases that prevent us from seeing the world. These biases then act like a dirty windshield. We think we're seeing clearly, but as our inner shortcuts and our misrememberings and our false assumptions build up, our vision gets muddier, and what we're seeing is actually a distortion of reality, and we don't even recognize that it's happening. So it's important to have a way to know when our inner voice is deceiving us and how we can regain clarity. Gathering key evidence and looking at it in an unbiased, objective way is critical when making big decisions, because big decisions have many moving parts, and big decisions have big consequences. What do I mean by big decisions? Decisions with both an emotional and a rational component to them. Complex decisions. Health decisions, such as whether to get a second opinion. Financial decisions, such as what home to buy. Career decisions, such as what job to take. Decisions on how to vote or think about a hot-button issue. So how is it that we can pry open cognitive space to allow for new information and insight? Is there a way that we can check and challenge our inner voice? I think there is, and in a way where we actually strengthen our relationship with other people. The solution is to change how we gather and synthesize information from others. I began thinking about this because of my background as an investigative journalist. I spent a decade at the business magazine Barron's, and there I ended up specializing in what you might call the bearish company story. Those are the stories that take a skeptical look at a company's finances or at its strategy. When my stories were published, sometimes there'd be a large share price reaction. Occasionally, a stock exchange would halt the stock, as it did with Pinnacle Oil, or regulators would get involved, as they did with Arrakis Energy. A couple of the companies that I wrote about went bust, such as Exodus Communications and Thermalase. For one company, car battery maker Exide Corp, the CEO was sentenced to 10 years in jail. These stories had a big impact on investors, employees, and customers, and the human toll of these stories weighed on me. I wanted to be sure that the biases of my inner voice, my desire as a journalist to dig deeply and expose questionable doings, wasn't also possibly leading me to make mistakes that could cause real harm. Perhaps this was in part because I had a recurring dream that I was a little girl wearing a big pair of shoes that were too heavy to lift off the ground. but also from the times when my editors and I received threats from powerful management teams who wanted to prevent my stories from being published, and from shareholders who'd lost money. So how could I know that I was conducting sound research? That I was thinking about the incentives of my sources, that I was marshaling evidence to back my assertions, and sticking with the data, that I wasn't falling for the bait of an inner voice's possibly false judgments. How could I know that I was telling a story that was true and that should be told? I started to think about how I gather information, and I thought, what if I do it one perspective at a time, like a series of concentric circles? I could start at the center, at the target of my investigation, so I could understand its incentives and motives. My goal was to allow each viewpoint to have the opportunity to speak for itself and to allow me to hear them and gain distance on my own inner voice. Some people, like Steve Jobs, counsel us that it's other voices that lead us astray, but I don't think that's right. I think that by looking at each voice, at all the voices that have a stake in a particular decision or situation, we can not only build empathy and understanding with others, but we can gain distance and challenge our own inner voice. Once I realized that perspective taking could be the power wash for my dirty windshield of bias, I needed a system to organize the viewpoints. I like the term AREA as an acronym for my process, and there are 5 steps. A, absolute, R, relative, E, exploration and exploitation, and final, A, analysis. I liked area because it fits with mapping terminology. What is my area of investigation? So how does it work? Let's travel to Nepal to meet an amazing young man named John Christopher, who founded a basic healthcare charity called the Oda Foundation. Oda operated a single clinic in a remote and mountainous region of Nepal. And he came to me to figure out how to grow the charity, but the very next day, the devastating earthquake hit Nepal and killed 10,000 people. Suddenly, John needed the growth plan immediately. He wrestled with 2 options. He could partner with the government's network of clinics, but they had a poor reputation, or he could open a second clinic. His experience and his inner voice told him to open the second clinic, but he wanted to check his gut, and I suggested he try my perspective-taking approach. In absolute, he began with primary information from Nepal itself. He wasn't sure that he could find reliable government data, but I asked him to check, and he was able to find both some population and healthcare statistics. He vetted Nepal's information against related sources from other healthcare charities that deliver emergency healthcare, and also from the World Health Organization. And he picked up some good tips and techniques. Then he dug deeper and explored other voices, speaking to doctors, government officials, and local lay leaders. This was pivotal, as success would depend on their community's buy-in. He checked his assumptions and exploitation, and he realized there were too many unknowns, not only in terms of possible patient numbers, but also in terms of costs. In addition, he also realized he'd mistakenly only focused on data that confirmed his inner voice. And he realized something important. Opening a second clinic could bankrupt Oda by stretching it to simply serve too many in need. And so in his final analysis, when he brought the perspectives back together, he realized that the decision that his inner voice told him was wrong was actually the right one for Oda, partnering with the government. He came up with a creative solution to maintain Oda's independence and doubled the number of patients that Oda served. By checking and challenging even the best intentions of his inner voice, John was able to get out of his own head. I had a similar experience myself. That night, when I hesitated on hitting send because my inner voice was yelling at me, I was using AREA to conduct an investigation into the World Bank that was published under the title, Can You Fight Poverty with a 5-Star Hotel? As some of you know, the bank is tasked with fighting poverty, and my investigation was looking at whether its investment performance was aligned with that important mission. So I first asked, In absolute, what could I learn by just having primary source information from the bank itself? Quite a lot, as it turns out. Squirreled away in a footnote, I found something surprising. The bank doesn't actually measure investment performance. Instead, it measures the performance of the entire company that it funds, and many of them are Fortune 500 companies, like Coca-Cola and Newmont Mining. Might the bank be misleading itself and others by not measuring its investment performance? And why were wealthy companies receiving cut-rate loans? I vetted the bank's information against information from related sources, and I read up on both groups that benefit from the bank and who are critics from the bank, academic reports, and literature reviews. Next, I dug deeper and I explored the voices of others by speaking with experts and current and former employees. The sequencing is important. These other voices schooled me in how to listen to the who, what, where, why, and how of the bank, so that when I finally spoke to the bank's evaluation chief, and he told me that once a company finishes a project, it doesn't track project performance. It only tracks company performance. I realized two things. First, he was inadvertently telling me that the bank had no idea how its investments were doing because it didn't track them. And second, he was telling me the bank didn't even do its own due diligence because it let the company self-report. Well, if the bank didn't know how its investments were doing, how could it know it was fighting poverty? This became important as my story unearthed that the bank was funding high-end shopping malls, fast food restaurants, and pricey five-star hotels, all of which seemed to have nothing to do with fighting poverty. But still, I wanted to check the suspicions of my inner voice. So in exploitation, I asked myself, could I conduct a pro-con analysis to check at the different issues that I was looking at? And that really helped me so that when I was in the final A analysis and I brought the perspectives back together, I was able to tamp down that critical inner voice that said, you can't possibly have understood that correctly. When my story was published, there was a ruckus. And how did the bank react? Just as my inner critical voice. It attacked me personally. And while that felt terrible, the good news is that the bank's letter to the magazine substantiated the themes of my story, and the bank since has changed the way it evaluates its investment performance to be better aligned with its important mission. By looking at my sources of information one perspective at a time, I didn't pursue a story that I thought might be true. I searched for a story that is true, based on a sound process of gathering and evaluating data. It's the opposite of Google, where you enter something into a search engine, and suddenly you're flooded by all perspectives at once. Not only can you not hear your own inner voice, you tend to listen to the loudest voices, the ones that come up first, and without any sense of their perspective or their incentives. At a time when technology and media companies are becoming ever more powerful at influencing us, it's up to us to figure out who we want to be, as opposed to responding to how they want us to act. I see it in my work with high schools and colleges, with Fortune 500 companies, with nonprofits, and with government agencies such as the United States State Department. We can check and challenge our inner voice to make confident, thoughtful decisions grounded in sound research. Ironically, it is by challenging our inner voice's assumptions and judgments that we check our ego, we can gain empathy with others, and we can build better self-awareness. Because true mindfulness is not just about turning inward, it's also about opening ourselves outward to discover and collect the wisdom of others. Thank you.